Welcome back to SFF180 Horror. On today's episode, Stephen King offers his fourth collection of 4 novellas, If It Bleeds, in which hope and perseverance are the threads that carry us through life. Thomas here, your host as always. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me. The wildly prolific Stephen King regularly contributes short fiction collections to his bibliography, some of which, beginning with Different Seasons in 1982, are specifically dedicated to 4 novellas. Now, at that time, it was an unusual thing, as novellas were hard to market. You might only see them in dedicated fiction magazines, most of which probably couldn't afford to buy a manuscript from Stephen King. And no one was as yet publishing novellas on their own in book form. Now, with novellas more popular than ever, King is sticking to his program with these collections, and 2020 has given us If It Bleeds. It's a mixture of Stephen King at both his most adventurous and his safest. But it's an easy bet that there's plenty here to satisfy longtime fans, even if I don't see it as a book you'd offer as a good introductory volume to new King readers. There's no overarching theme here as there was in Different Seasons, but in the first 2 stories, King is definitely playing with new approaches to horror and weird fiction. And there's a general focus throughout the book on optimism. I'm not sure if it's a sign that King in 2019-2020 is reading the American Room, so to speak, and gauging our nation's anxieties during a historically awful period, but in these stories, he offers his characters and readers a sense of hope, even defiant hope, in the face of a terrifying future. The book opens with Mr. Harrigan's Phone, a sort of black comedy satire about, you guessed it, the ubiquity of smartphone technology, set in the mid-2000s when such technology was new, its ultimate impact on our lives far from fully understood. Unlike his 2006 novel Cell, a deeply pessimistic book released just before the iPhone changed everything, King avoids cliches about mind-controlling signals and such in favor of a story about the way smartphones influence our interpersonal connections and the way we've come to live so much of our emotional lives online. Our protagonist is Craig, a 12-year-old kid in a small town who makes a little extra cash working for a retired tycoon named John Harrigan, mostly reading books to him. Mr. Harrigan, who had a reputation as a bit of a shark in his professional days, occasionally gives his hired help scratch tickets. When one of these scores young Craig a $3,000 bounty, Craig buys Harrigan a brand new first-generation iPhone as a thank you, and the old man, at first a skeptical Luddite, quickly takes to the device when he sees how it can track stocks in real time. Harrigan dies of natural causes not long after, and at the funeral, Craig slips the phone into Harrigan's jacket pocket, which will have interesting results. I really enjoyed the way King depicts the iPhone and the characters' reactions to it, with a real sense for the endorphin rush we all get when some brand new life-changing technology comes our way for the very first time. And yet Harrigan's observations about this little gadget's potential impact convincingly sound like they come from a character with a long history of success in business, who understands both the benefits and hazards posed by products that reshape human lives, which is to say they don't sound like an authorial lecture. Mostly this is a gentle story about how, regardless of technology, people impact us more than anything else, and it's stronger for the way its supernatural horror elements are kept extremely low-key. The Life of Chuck comes next, and it's one of the best things I've read from King in ages. He's working in very experimental territory here, relating the death at age 39 from a brain tumor and life of bank employee Charles Krantz in reverse chronological order over 3 chapters, each of which could work as a fantastic standalone story, and all of which are tied together at the end through a clever solipsistic twist. Now, it's best to walk into this one knowing as little as possible, so all I will say is that while the opening sequence is the story's scariest, and the closing sequence offers haunting recollections of Chuck's childhood, it's the middle sequence that has probably the most joyous expression of any of Stephen King's stories in his whole career. This is a story all about carpe diem, capturing those fleeting moments of happiness in a lifetime that's all too short and fraught with stress and anxiety. And if the modern world of 2020 has been just a little too upsetting for you to process, well, this may be the story to put you back on an emotional keel. The Life of Chuck is so freaking good that the next one, the centerpiece of the whole collection, cannot quite measure up, though it's likely to please fans. If It Bleeds is a 200-page short novel that serves as a direct sequel to 2018's The Outsider, which I considered one of King's stronger late-career novels. If The Life of Chuck showed King taking risks, this one plants him squarely within his comfort zone, writing what amounts to a Stephen King story on autopilot, organized with such fidelity to his established plot formulas that you can practically visualize the outline while you're reading it. None of this is to say it's lousy, just a story that disappoints mainly because all it's doing is catering to fans. Holly Gibney, the brainy, long-suffering introvert, who possibly has ASD and who served as Bill Hodges' assistant throughout the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, here comes into her own as a protagonist. If It Bleeds opens with a horrific school bombing. Holly now owns and runs the Finders Keepers private investigation service, and as she watches local news reports about the disaster, she gets a suspicious feeling about the reporter delivering live updates from the scene. Long story short, Holly becomes convinced this guy may be another outsider responsible for the bombing, and in order to unmask him, she may need to set a trap, using herself as bait. There are some very good moments here, especially the detours into Holly's family life, where she endures a mother who's both judgy and clingy, and quietly grieves as she watches a beloved uncle slip into the final stages of Alzheimer's. But the investigation plot feels a bit contrived. The final confrontation relies too much on convenient coincidences, and the middle of the story contains one of those massive info dumps about the monster's history that I remember King inflicting upon us going back at least as far as 1983's Christine. It is, I suppose, a story that gets the job done, and Holly is likable enough, but it's not one where he is exactly challenging us or himself. In the final story, Rats, the protagonist is, wait for it, a struggling writer stranded in a remote cabin while fierce storms rage outside. Yeah, again, this is unmistakably a comfort zone premise, but I say it's better entertainment, mainly because its narrative engine is fueled by dark humor, rather than despair and woe, like some of King's earlier stories starring writers, books like The Dark Half and Bag of Bones. And considering this story must have been written no later than 2019, the coincidence between what happens to Drew Larson during his sabbatical at the cabin and this year's COVID-19 outbreak gives the story an added level of interest, to say the least. Drew Larson has had sporadic success with short fiction over the years, but he can't quite seem to push out a novel. His previous attempt resulted in a nervous breakdown, so Drew's very patient wife is wary when he excitedly exclaims that he's gotten a sudden burst of inspiration for a novel so fully formed in his head that writing it, he declares, will be just like taking dictation. Drew retreats to an extremely remote family cabin to write, and at first the book, a Western, really does come to him very quickly, but then Drew comes down with an absolutely horrendous case of the flu. Next, a torrential rainstorm lasting days practically cuts him off from all civilization. Worst of all, the sicker Drew gets, he starts sliding back into his old writer's block. But in the midst of the deluge, an unexpected visitor suddenly shows up at the cabin. There's a Faustian bargain involved and a metaphor so outrageously on the nose about human nature acting on self-interest and making whatever justifications are necessary that all you can do is chuckle at it. But I think that's what King is after here, the knowing laugh, as we plunge into Rod Serling territory, where moral themes are delivered with a smile and a nod rather than a stern wagging finger. I got a kick out of this one, and it ends the collection on a high note. And there you have it. That's all I have time for this episode. Remember, the most important thing, these are reviews. You will not always agree with me, but if you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe if you have not done so. That is how the channel grows. You can also support the channel at my TeePublic store and at my Patreon, where recruits in the Winx Army get little perks like getting to see some of my videos early access. I want to thank all of those lovely people for their added support. It is extremely helpful, especially in these tough times. I know it's a sacrifice. I want to thank all the rest of you for being the very best viewers in all of BookTube, and Until I see all of you next time, stay safe, stay spooky, remember to vote on November 3rd, and happy reading.